Hello and welcome back for another session of On Book, the Old Globe Shakespeare Reading Group. So glad to have you back with us. Thank you to so many of you who've stuck with us for the last few weeks as we've made our way through the Taming of the Shrew. Next week, we're going to start our conversation about Henry V. What I'll do this week is post some discussion questions, general discussion questions to close out our conversation about Taming of the Shrew and maybe make a pivot. Today, I am very delighted to finish up our conversation about the Taming of the Shrew by doing more close reading of certain parts of the text. On Tuesday, we had the opportunity to have director Shauna Cooper back with us to do close reading of Kate's final speech in the play. And today I am delighted to welcome voice, speech, and text coach Ursula Meyer. So we can get Ursula on there. Hello, Ursula. How are you?
I'm good.
I was telling Ursula, ordinarily during this part of the session, I sort of read a general bio of the person and talk about what is their background and their history. But I feel like with actors and directors, we have a sense of what that role is in the theater, and especially on a Shakespeare play. But when you're looking at somebody who does voice and speech, I think it might be helpful if you could talk a little bit about what is that role? What's your background? How did you get into this? And what's your role as a voice and speech person, especially particularly on a Shakespeare play?
Thank you. Wonderful, Danielle. I'm currently at UCSD in my 25th year. I started in the 80s. I'm not going to date myself totally. As I got my MFA from the University of Washington. I call it my Mighty Fine Actor Award. And for some reason, I was drawn to it. It was drawn to me. I worked in the summers at the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, the Illinois Shakespeare Festival, the Idaho Shakespeare Festival, and eventually the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. And I was there a couple of years. And they had actually gotten a kind of a negative review in the Shakespeare Quarterly about audibility in their big outdoor stage, which has no microphones. And so they said, so I was acting in the shows, but I had been sort of teaching on the side, accents, voice, speech, in my past. And the artistic director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, who is not with us anymore, the marvelous Jerry Turner, but you can't talk about him without doing him, took me into his office and has said, can you sit in the back and write down what you can't hear? And so that's how it started. And I always say that the audience is the biggest authority on what they can hear and what they can understand. So voice and text coaches should really be the most important people on the creative team. But he had me. I ran with my Betty the Whore costume from Threepenny Opera to Titus Andronicus rehearsal and wrote down while crying when the marvelous Henry Warnitz was performing Titus, and Nancy Carlin had just had her hands cut off, and I wrote, final T, you need to put a T on that word so we can understand it, and then raced back and did the last part of Threepenny Opera. And I did that for a number of years. And then for various reasons decided to pivot into teaching more, and taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And while I was there, I was teaching voice and text and Shakespeare. I wanted to know more. So I went to the Central School of Speech and Drama for a year. And there's where I got to study with Cicely Berry, who was the first voice coach ever, really, at the Royal Shakespeare Company, but also the wonderful Patsy Rodenberg, the incredible David Carey, Andrew Wade, phenomenal teachers. We're all voice teachers, speech teachers, breath and sound teachers, but we're also very passionately linked to how do we take what's on the page in Shakespeare and help an actor make it clear and make it sing and make it expressive. Now, voice coaches in shows do all kinds of things. We do, well, how is this word pronounced? We do, is there a dialect? Many Shakespeare shows have dialects. Henry V has a bunch of different dialects. Sometimes the character is double cast. Sometimes they're in disguise. Sometimes they're in an outdoor venue without microphones. Sometimes they lose their voice and you need to help them get it back. So we do all those things. But on a Shakespeare show, we do, what am I saying? I don't understand what I'm saying. I have the answer. I can help you. I can tell you what are you saying? But then how do I say it for an audience who's hearing it for the very first time? How do I say it so that they understand it clearly? And, at first, you have to dispel the myth that it's, when we talk to kids in the schools, we say, why is Shakespeare hard? And they'll say, because it's in another language. And I'll say, oh, really? What language is that? Oh, Italian, Latin, English, nobody speaks anymore. And then I always say, well, I'm going to open up this copy of Romeo and Juliet, and I'm going to see if anybody speaks Italian, Old English, or Latin, and if they can translate this for me. And then I read the line, where is your mother? And they say, wait a minute, that's a different version. And I say, no, that is the version. So it's also finding a way as the voice coach to give the actors confidence and ease and help them speak the text in such a way that is truthful, but also has the breadth of kings and warriors and queens, and give it to the audience in such a way that they don't worry about understanding it. And there's no longer sort of a perfect, correct way to do it. Every director has a different vision. And so it's also the voice coach's vision to figure out what the style is of the speaking, what the style is of the play in general, and how to fit that in. So it's a lot of wonderful jobs. Yeah, go ahead.
When you talk about the style of the speaking, what do you mean? Are you speaking about more than just an accent?
Yeah, and we sometimes the play is set in a different time, and you may still want people to say new or duke instead of duke. But maybe if it's set in New York, I mean, if it in Comedy of Errors that we did a few years ago, this would be, if we do Taming of the Shrew, which we hope we will be doing, this would be my 6th season at the Outdoor Globe. And every director has had a different idea. He wants it to sound a little more contemporary, or she wants it to sound a little more like the 18th century, or we want it to be, certain plays lend themselves to grittiness, muscularity. Henry V is very muscular. It's a lot of soldiers talking about war until the French scene, and then of course I have to coach the French if I'm doing that. But Much Ado is much more, was lighter and more of the period of the 20s. We had a kind of
without us even realizing it as an audience, we are getting a texture from the language. Things like, do you say duke or do you say duke? Things make it sound maybe more contemporary or more historical or more period. Do you actually distinguish in a 1920s sound from an 1800s sound or from a modern sound?
Well, I think for Much Ado, we tried to get a little bit of that swagger into the sound, a little bit of what the director, Kathleen Marshall, was so brilliant because she comes from a choreographic background, and she's a brilliant choreographer as well as a director. She had, in the way people moved, there was a sense of sort of the 20s swagger, and so we tried to the way that the snappiness of the dialogue and the back and forth, and that play lent itself brilliantly to that because of all the witty banter between people. So
sorry, go ahead.
So I mainly need to serve that vision, and then I have kind of a double boss. My boss is also Shakespeare, who wrote a particular play with a particular story. So I'm often in on the cutting of things. We need to cut that. We need to make this shorter. It's too long outside. The seats are too hard. Well, but if we cut that, then maybe we'll lose we won't get what's happening later, because that sets up that. And so how about if I suggest a cut here or suggest a cut there? And sometimes I work with the director and the dramaturg on that.
As you mentioned, you've been working voice and speech for our outdoor festival shows for many years, 6 years at least, you said, and you're slated to work on The Taming of the Shrew this summer. And I'm curious what your background is with The Taming of the Shrew and what makes it a unique challenge textually or from a voice and speech perspective.
Okay, so first of all, I think this is my 4th or 5th. I find the play fascinating because it's incredibly provocative and controversial. A man taming a woman so that she'll make a good wife. What? Not in today's time. So I have been privileged to work with a lot of directors who took a lot of thoughtful time I did a production where the director made it into a tragedy. This was back in the 70s, where the Petruchio finally ended up taming Kate, but then she was kind of a bimbo, and did everything he said. And the end of the play, he was sad and drunk, and at the party. So that's really controversial.
Interesting, yeah.
Then I've done, but most of the time, the wonderful productions that, and they've all had a bright, beautiful spirit. Most of the time, it's about two human beings who are struggling to figure out who they are, who have an idea of who they are, and both learn how to be vulnerable and come together. And so it's actually about two people rather than one. And I worked on Rebecca Teichmann's production a couple of years ago at the Shakespeare Theatre Company, and the idea of the woman being slightly controlled by an idea of what a woman should be, and frustrated, and finding out that she didn't have to be that in order to be a strong woman in this world. And there's always a kind of a wonderful thing for us is trying to figure out how to make this a story about a strong woman who continues to be strong, and a man who thinks he has to be an alpha male and maybe can find vulnerability. And the various Petruchios that I've had a chance to work with Marco Baricelli and Meryl Peaks, they've all found that wonderful. I think I know what I'm doing. Do I? And that's why the particular speech that we're going to look at today is a wonderful example of Petruchio having a clear plan, that he thinks he has all the answers, and then allows himself to be vulnerable to that thing that you can't control, which is love, spark, sex, joy, desire.
Well, let's take a look at the text that you brought in, and I'm curious. One of the things that we've been talking to actors, directors, and scholars about in the group is, are there ways that we can take some of the techniques that actors and directors use to really analyze and pick apart text, and help use them ourselves as readers to help us make sense of these texts when we're reading them in our own living rooms, whether we're reading them out loud or reading them in our head. So I'll look forward to sort of talking through this text with you and figuring out, how do you coach an actor to, when they're approaching this kind of text, what are the techniques that you use and how do you talk about it? So let me pull this up on the screen for us to take a look at. I'm going to hide. I'll be here.
I'll miss you. I'm going to talk in general about the particular poetic device that's here, because it's something that's part of all our lives. The idea of antithesis, the idea of setting the word against the word, as Shakespeare calls it. But also, there isn't a single television commercial that doesn't say, yesterday I had bad breath. Then I took this mouthwash and now I have great breath. So the idea of a before and after, we live by sun and moon, night and day, birth and death, youth and aging. We have these opposites in our lives all the time. And particularly at the time of Shakespeare, the world was kind of exploding. Things coming in from foreign lands. The sort of small medieval life was just changing radically. And so there was this dichotomy between the new and the old. And words, particularly, were a way for them to cope with this idea. And so Shakespeare loved antithesis. He loved, two households, both alike in dignity, and yet they were opposite, the Capulets and the Montagues. Antony and Cleopatra, the opposite of what is Egypt and Rome, and how they are opposing. And in this play, again, two people who think they have it all figured out, that this is how I should be, and this is how I will get through, and then see each other, and the rhetoric and the math. I think of rhetoric a little bit as math. This antithesis is math. It just falls apart. So Petruchio, those of you who probably know the play a little bit, comes to town. He hears about this young woman who is really, really difficult. No one can get her to, I hate to say behave, but calm down enough, be soft enough, be willing enough to be married. And she's the oldest daughter. In those days, the older daughter had to get married before the younger daughter. So the father has to marry her off and wants to do it, but nobody is interested because she's so wild. And Petruchio, who is down on his luck financially, thinks, this is going to be easy. I'm a tough guy. I know exactly how I will handle her, tame her, form her. And I love to look at the concordance of words. It's very interesting that the word love is 65 times in Taming of the Shrew. The word honor is 65 times. The word man is, I think, there's quite a few, like 94 times man is said, woman only 15.
Could you tell us what a concordance is and how that's something that you might use?
Yeah. Oh, it's a terrific. I just open sources Shakespeare. You can just type in a word and it'll tell you how many times it's said in the play. It'll show you where it's said in the play. It'll show you how many times it's said in all of Shakespeare. So it's a wonderful little technique. I mean, just the idea of both love and honor 65 times, but Kate, he calls her Kate 30 times in his first speech. Something that he has been told she hates. And he only calls her Catherine twice at the end of that scene to soften her. So
this was actually a question.
Way through. Yeah.
This was actually a question we had earlier in our conversations about, what the difference is her different names for Katharina or Katarina and Catherine and Kate. And it seems like they have a big difference from a voice or speech perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think of Shakespeare as a great storyteller, but also a poet, and poets, the music is as important as the content. Sound is sense, form is content, and so when she prefers Catherine, she says, "They call me Catherine that do talk of me," which is a much softer sound, Catherine. That it's drawn out a little. Kate has a kind of hard sound to it. Has got a hard sound at the beginning and the end. It's one syllable. It's kind of an attack, Kate. And so when he knows that she prefers Catherine, and he spends the first whole speech to her in the scene where they meet 30 times in the first, well, I think it's 10 times in the first speech, calling her Kate, and then continuing. But let's look at the speech.
Let me bring that speech back up. And this is Act 2, Scene 1, yes? A Petruchio speech?
Yes, and this is right before the father calls her to come in, and he's thinking, how am I going to turn her from a wild Kate to a tameable Kate, is how he puts it. And so most of the time, the Petruchios they're thinking out loud, but a soliloquy is nice when it's a dialogue with the audience. You invite the audience to help you out here. And so here's an example of a whole list of antithesis. In fact, another poetic device is a list or a ladder. So he actually builds a ladder of this particular math problem. He says, say that she rail. Rail is a wonderful word, but means basically ranting. Say that she rail. Why then, I'll tell her plain, she sings as sweetly as a nightingale. So it's basically the idea is you're going to use reverse psychology. But if I was working with an actor, I would say, you want to make a voice choice. Maybe you make that first sound ugly and the next one sound beautiful. Maybe use a low pitch and a high pitch to give us these opposites. Then he says, say that she frown. I'll say she looks as clear as morning roses newly washed with dew. Say she be mute and will not speak a word. Well, then I'll commend her volubility. So if she doesn't talk, I'll say, what a wonderful, eloquent person you are. How wonderful, what a great conversationalist you are. I'll say she uttereth piercing eloquence. If she do bid me pack, and that means similar to what it means today, pack up, get out, and send you packing, I'll give her thanks as though she bid me stay by her a week, as though she invited me to stay for a whole week. And then the final one in his list is if she denied to wed, if she refuses to marry me, I'll talk about how I'm looking forward to the wedding announcement when I shall ask the bands, that was kind of a thing they did. They made a big to-do to announce to the village that somebody was getting married. And when I'm married, I'll crave the day when we announce our marriage and when we do our marriage. And so he's built himself a little list of these little math problems. What if this happens? Well, then this. Well, what if this happens? Well, then this. What if this happens? Well, then this. And it keeps building until he's pretty cocksure that it's going to work out. He's going to figure it out. But here she comes. And sometimes there's a scream from off stage in some productions. So then he has a little bit of a uh-oh. But I'm going to be okay because I just made this list of things. But here she comes, and now Petruchio speak. And then she comes in. And I have yet to see a production where there isn't a spark between them, something magic, something that defies all this very logical rhetoric that he's just built up. And he's swept away by how, not just her beauty, but there's something magnetic about her. They immediately are right for each other. I'm told this happens in life. My husband tells me it happened for him. So I don't think Shakespeare's just making it up here. But what's exciting is that this is the first time they meet. And then kind of the rest of the play, they both are fighting this feeling that they are right for each other. And so what's fun for us as an audience is to see slowly them working very hard to insult each other, to come back at each other. And the next scene, when you read it, they're absolutely a match for each other. He throws something, she throws it right back. And it's actually quite exciting, like Lady Anne and Richard, exciting for them to meet an intellectual match. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And the more he irks her, the more she has a comeback. And that happens off and on. He kind of softens in some scenes, she softens in some scenes, but then the other one provokes the other one until finally, at the end of the play, and every director does it differently, there's a feeling of they're going to make it together, unlike maybe some of the other couples in the play who went at their relationship in a more conventional way. I've been blabbing and blabbing, so if you have some questions.
Well, please, and I'm going to invite people in our side comments to ask some questions. I'm curious about this question of scansion, or the question of rhythm and meter in the play, especially into, let's say, a text like this one. Is that something that you're working with an actor to integrate, or to help figure out the meaning of the line? How is it used, or how can it help an actor, or how can it help us as readers try to figure out meanings of these lines?
Yeah, that's a whole other hour, but
I know, sorry about that.
Very quickly, it was a common thing at the time for Shakespeare to write in the rhythm of iambic pentameter. It's very close to the rhythm of actual speech. If I would ask you now to write a line that was itself a line of perfect speech, the line that I'd be speaking to you now would be the kind of line you'd want to write. And the other writers of the time wrote in this rhythm. The 5 beats makes it less sing-songy, less nursery rhymey. But the idea of writing in rhythm goes way back to Greek dance steps. That's how people remembered when there wasn't a society where everything was written down or everybody could read. So this rhythm helps you remember. But Shakespeare's such a genius. He will give you a rhythm that is this regular sort of rhythm of the heartbeat, ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. Boom, 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 and you feel like the heartbeat is kind of regular, even. And in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo and Juliet first meet, they make a sonnet together, they rhyme together, so we know they're right for each other. But then once in a while, he'll introduce something that is a skip a beat, or a different kind of beat. And this speech particularly, instead of saying, say that she rail, why then I'll tell her plain, he starts with an attack. Say that she rail. Why then I'll tell her plain, she sings as sweetly as a nightingale. So the first line, the sort of negative thing, has that attack at the beginning, and then the antithesis is all in iambic, which is very smooth rhythm. So that's the kind of thing that I will scan the whole text. And then there's also options. Actors don't have to scansion. Nobody playing Juliet will say gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds. They'll always say gallop apace. And that rhythm has to do with the sound of galloping horses, which she's talking about, the mythological horses in the sky. But it's also about her urgency. She wants night to come. So the trochee, or the stress that isn't the rhythm of the heartbeat, it's bum bum, is because she's anxious, and he gives you just gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds. All the rest of it is what we call the heartbeat rhythm, but the first line is that strong. And there's many other variations. It's just wonderful, genius, geek Shakespeare stuff to explore.
One of the things I know that I have learned so much from voice and text people is there's really not a lot of, obviously, stage direction in Shakespeare's plays. You don't get a lot of like beat, you know. In a modern play, you might have like he pauses or he like sits down, or, you know, we have a lot of physical description of what our actors are doing. And in Shakespeare's plays, the kind of the most we get is like enter, exit, horns, exit pursued by a bear. I mean, we don't get a lot of stage directions. But one of the things I've really learned from voice and speech people is how to figure out physicality in the rhythm of the text. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'll say two things. It's he in Hamlet, he talks about how to act to the players. He was very conscious of acting problems, and pausing is a big acting problem. So if you keep on the rhythm of the language, it doesn't give you a chance to pause and scratch your nose. You keep the play moving forward. And if it's a very emotional scene, he will literally give you an O for the emotion to come out, so that you don't have to pause and sob for a while and then go on. But sometimes a line will not have 10 beats. Iambic pentameter means 5 sets of 2 beats. 5 times 2 is 10. Juliet has a line where she's suddenly scared before she takes the potion. And she has a line where she says, "Nurse, what should she do here? My dismal scene, I needs must act alone."
We lost you for a second. We lost you for a second. Would you say that line again?
So she suddenly
panics. Would you say the line again?
Yes. It's right before she's about to take the potion, and she panics and decides to call for her nurse. And she says, "Nurse." And then Shakespeare gives you a dash. And then after that, she says, "What should she do here? My dismal scene," taking the potion, "my dismal scene, I needs must act alone." So in that little dash is really the amount of time it would take for you to go to the door and then change your mind, or for you to have that nurse, "What should I do? What should I do?" And then, "What should she do here?" So it's a wonderful clue sometimes, and in particular shared lines where half a line is one character and half a line is the other character. If you don't breathe between, if you share them like Lady M and Mackers do in that play that I don't say the name of, it's like they're breathing together, and the word conspire means to breathe together. So if they don't take pauses, if they make it one line of verse, then we get the feeling of that conspiring.
That's wonderful. We have a question here I'm going to pull up on the screen. Why is there so much thesis antithesis in Shakespeare? We've talked about it on a large thematic or dramatic structural level, and we talked about it on a line-to-line basis. Is there an answer to the why?
I mean, I think the time, the time was changing. I think he was ahead of his time and looking at old ways and new ways. I think he was really interested in the paradox of class. So many plays are about someone from a lower class trying to get up, someone often from a higher class, Henry IV, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown," that doesn't want to be a king, wants to go down. And so those exchanges of power are fascinating to him. And oftentimes that has to do with, to be or not to be is one of the most famous lines of Shakespeare, and it's about the questions of life and death. One of my favorite dramaturgs, besides Danielle, Louis Douthit, always says, when she looks at a speech, "What is the dilemma?" And a good playwright gives you the dilemma. And there's nothing better than a piece of antithesis to illustrate that dilemma. And sometimes he even puts them right together in an oxymoron. When Juliet is talking about Romeo having killed her cousin, fiend angelical, dove-feathered raven, putting those opposites, that sort of super antithesis together, we get the conflict that's going on inside her.
Is this something that you see more? Shakespeare writes both in this poetry, the iambic pentameter, and also in prose, which is a different mode that perhaps relates to the class question that you're talking about a little bit. Is it something that you see, this thesis antithesis, in both poetry and prose?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Sometimes the prose has more rhetoric in it. I think the verse is a little more formal. You see it in court people, and some like the people in the taverns in Henry V are more in prose. Sometimes when people get very intimate, they suddenly drop the language. In Twelfth Night, Olivia is in prose, and Viola kind of brings her in the scene together in verse, kind of lifts her up out of her sad state of truth and reality. She's in mourning to a state of love, heightened state of love. So he uses it very cleverly. Iago is in prose for a good portion of the play because he's a servant and in the scene with Othello, and then not in his monologues, but in the scene with Othello. And he takes Othello when he kind of crumbles him down into prose, and then Iago goes up into verse. So it sometimes does a power thing. But it's really fascinating. 77% of the plays were in poetry, rhythm, and then some plays almost all in verse, Richard II. Some plays almost all in prose, Merry Wives of Windsor, which is about kind of a domestic family, three I Love Lucy episodes, whereas Richard II is about a king becoming deposed. So it's a more heightened thing.
Well, as we're sort of coming to the end of our time, I want to ask you, we're shifting to talking about Henry V now. Is there anything from your perspective as a voice and text person that is different between comedies and histories in terms of how we read them or in terms of how the text works? Or do you have any tips for us as we start reading this play? Any of your techniques that you think we could borrow as we're reading the plays to help us understand them better?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to be sacrilegious here and just say that the Kenneth Branagh film is a fine film. He really called in all his superpower friends, Judi Dench and Derek Jacobi and Paul Scofield. I mean, there's an incredible set of actors in that film. He had already done it on stage, stole a lot of the things from the stage production, the music and the killing of the boys and all. So I think that's a good place to start. It's very well done, very moving. When you're reading it, I think it's a wonderful thing to just think of it as this coming of age story. A young, very young king. You can go back to the history, and he really was a young king that was quite beloved. So sad that he died young because he was actually quite good at it. And just to see him go from that sort of young, intuitive king to a real powerful, important leader. And it's wonderful to read about the Battle of Agincourt. It wasn't quite as dramatic as Shakespeare makes it, but it is a true battle, and it was an incredible set of odds against the French. That the French were slated to win for a million reasons, and they didn't. So reading about the actual battle, my husband is a fight choreographer, and he walked the field in England, and it meant so much to him. So I think what's great about the histories is that they really are about real events. And so going back and doing that. Also, if you're a real geek, go back and look at the Olivier film, because it's a beautiful, beautiful film. And it was made as a propaganda film during World War II about England and the power. And Kenneth Branagh's film is a reaction to that because of the Falkland crisis and everything. It's kind of an anti-war film. So it's very interesting to look at the same play from both perspectives.
Wow. Well, maybe we'll be lucky enough to have you back and talk a little bit about rhetoric and those big, rousing speeches in Henry V.
I would love that.
Well, thank you so much for loaning us your time and expertise and helping us get to know this play a little bit better. I really appreciate your presence with us today. So thank you so much, Ursula.
Thank you so much. It was a huge pleasure. I love to talk about this.
Oh, good. Well, so do I. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you again next week. Looks like we'll be doing Wednesday and Friday next week. I'll post those events soon, and we'll start talking about the histories in general and Henry V. So thank you again so much. Goodbye, all.